So in this video, we're going to talk about what I have always referred to as the life timeline. In clinical circles, this is called mapping. I didn't know that at the time when this came to me. So here's what that looks like. And each mapping or each life timeline is totally different. It all just depends upon your client and the life that they have endured. But this, for our purposes, I'm just going to draw this out as an example. So we're going to start here at birth and just continue on with the person's life. And the assumption is made here that that they're alive, they're not dead, because if they were dead, they wouldn't be visiting you in your office. So somewhere shortly after birth and before the age of 5, it can happen as late as 8, but 5 seems for some reason to be the golden age. At about 5 years old, some sort of abuse happens. Now, that abuse is perceived abuse, actually. I had one client, for example, who he came to see me, and we found out that his abuse, his circumstances were simply that he was born way premature in a time when premature babies were taken and put into incubators. In fact, he drew me drawings of his life, and the very first alter personality was of a baby in a box. That was the very first time that he split. And after he was healthy enough to go home, and he was in this box, this incubator, for about 2 months. And the only contact that he received was from the nurses, who 2 or 3 times a day made sure he was fed and made sure his diaper was changed, but there was no real love or bonding that he received. And so when it was time for him to go home, his parents were very wealthy, and instead of going home to his mother, he went home to a nanny, and he was raised by nannies. And from that point on, the perceived emotional trauma for him was simply a lack of love and a lack of bonding. 90% of the time, the trauma will be actual physical abuse that is accompanied by an enormous amount of emotional energy that comes with it. So what happens is, as we've explained before in previous videos, the spirit splits and a personality is created. And that personality is created basically to absorb the brunt of the abuse so that the rest of the spirit can separate from the body. As it's absorbing that abuse, you usually end up with 2 categories. You have the personalities that hold, and what they hold is generally emotion. Some of them hold memory, and we'll talk about them in later videos. But they hold emotion. And then you have another category that I call the doers. And what they do is they simply do. They do whatever is necessary or whatever's required of them to get the whole system through a troublesome spot, particularly abuse. They just do. They go along, do what they're told, because somebody else is holding the emotion, and they don't have to. They're completely detached from that. And so what that looks like is you have a whole category up here. We're just going to place them up here, and we're going to call them emotion holders. And they simply hold on to the emotion of the abuse so that these down here, the doers, can do whatever is required. Now, as the abuse happens at an early age, before 5, these personalities become very prevalent, and they can be, if you go back, starting from present day, and you go back with age regression and you get to them, what you're going to find is that they're very undeveloped. A personality, for example, and you always hear the classic cases where you've got a personality or a person that switches and another personality comes and they are fully developed and ready to take on a different life path. Well, and I have had plenty of clients like that. A term that they gave me, and I use it affectionately, is a Rolodex out of control. Mainly because the majority of my clients were old enough to have used Rolodexes in those days. If you don't know what a Rolodex is, Google it. Anyhow, these personalities, as you get closer here, they are more developed because they have had more exposure to life experiences. That is the simplest way of putting it. Then, somewhere along the line, as different life experiences happen, other personalities are created. For example, when I got married to my wife at the time, she had one personality that was the bride. And her specific function was to be the bride. After the wedding vows were exchanged, she went away. And I think I saw her maybe a couple, 3 times after that. But she was preserved for that specific role because way back here, they knew that that was going to be necessary. So then what happens is you have personalities who develop as life goes on to do different functions. For example, taking care of kids, careers. I had one client who was a medical doctor. And I've been asked this many times. Well, Keith, would you trust somebody with your life who has multiple personalities? And I said, well, heck yeah. Of course I would, as long as it was under control and in certain circumstances. When she went to work, she was Dr., and we're going to call her Kathy. She was Dr. Kathy. And Dr. Kathy at work was not distracted by a husband or marital relationships or kids or any schedule, anything that was outside of the scope of work. It was just irrelevant to her. So when she was on as Dr. Kathy, she was extremely focused. If I had a need for somebody like that to be extremely focused, that's great. Well, this happens within a system. So for the host, this is a need-to-know basis. And it's not necessary for this one to know. In fact, it would be a hindrance for this one to know about all that happened in the past. She is better able to do her job by not knowing. Here's a good example as to what that looks like. If you can imagine life, that there's the road of life, and you're in the body, which is a bus. Okay, and you got one of these personalities that's up there driving the bus. And they're doing just fine as the bus driver. They're not even aware of what's happening behind them in the seats in the back. And then they come up to a bump in the road, and one of these in the back says, oh, wait a minute, I've seen this before. I'm an expert with these kind of bumps. And they come forward, and one of two things happens. Either the bump is so severe that they have to grab the driver and pull them out, and they usually put a bag over their head or something so that they don't even remember what happens. And then this other one jumps in the driver's seat because they were created for that, and they drive through that bump, and then they switch places again, and the driver's back driving, completely unaware that any of this has ever even happened. What that looks like is, wow, I have no idea what happened, but I guess I got through it somehow. That's one way that looks. Another way is, and this happens more times than not, is whoever is familiar with those kind of bumps in the road will come and superimpose themselves on the driver and drive the bus and get through the bump, and then they will just simply take their place back in one of the seats. And what that looks like, and you hear this all the time. You hear, you know what? I have no idea how I did that, but I guess I just reached inside of me and I had some sort of strength come up that came and helped me through that. And I'm so grateful for that. Another situation, and you hear this from rape victims all the time. They will say, while that was happening to me, I felt myself leave my body, and it was like I was standing over here watching that happen to me. And then when it was all over, the next thing I remember, I was waking up, or the next thing I remember, I was going to the bathroom, or I was rescued, or whatever. Okay? That is another form of dissociation. And what happens there is somebody back here whose job it was to experience those things and to get the system through those kind of bumps in the road, okay, they came forward, they absorbed and took on the whatever needed to be done to get through that moment, and then they are now back here dealing with that energy. And the way that's dealt with in a system is it's compartmentalized and it's shuffled off to the emotion holders up here. And in fact, if they don't have enough to help them, they simply create more. How many? That's always a good question. The number doesn't matter. The number of ultra personalities that you will find in a system is exactly what that system needs. So you could have, according to one perception, you could have literally hundreds and hundreds of personalities. When you get behind the curtain and you're introduced to the mindscape, the world that they live in, you can literally have cities full of different personalities that if you were to talk to each and every one individually, you would find out that they are all unique, and yet they share some common ground, and that common ground is usually, oh, I'm part of, and I'm just picking on a name here, Kathy. I'm part of Kathy. And what do you do for Kathy? Well, I do this one thing. I hold a part of a memory, or I hold sadness, or I hold anger, or I hold whatever. Or you can have a few dozen personalities, and they have somehow, in some very creative way, figured out what to do with that energy, that emotional energy. But one thing that you will find is that in every instance, that energy is held outside of the body, usually in the auric field, and I have seen it carried out beyond the auric field. Now, why would that be? Well, there's a very simple principle there. The body's designed to process energy. And if you have more energy entering into the body than what it can process, it will overwhelm the body, and the body will simply die. I learned that, or that was taught to me after several nights of clearing pain and emotional pain from my wife when I was being taught how to do energy work by her alter personalities. Personality after personality after personality would come forward. And finally, I got a hold of her higher self, and I said, you know what? I've been doing this for months now. I'm not getting any work, or I'm not getting any sleep, and I have to get up in the morning and help get the kids off to school, and then somehow I've got to run a business only to come and do this again. Can't we just get them all together and just do it all at the same time? And I was taught, well, we could, but then she would die. Okay, well, we don't want that. And since then, I have learned other ways of being able to release this energy in mass without bringing it into the body. And we'll discuss that in other videos. You're going to love those. So back to our drawing. Here's another situation that happens. Let's suppose that over time, some of this emotion is released. They can very easily integrate, join back together, because their purpose is no longer necessary. Now, I have to be very careful how I say that. Just because their purpose is not necessary does not in any way diminish their value. In a system, every personality is absolutely important. In fact, I had a conversation with a therapist just a day before yesterday, and they are from the old school, and she told me, well, really, all you have to do is find the personality that they want to be and empower them to tell all the other personalities that they do not have a right to run the life. And I said, well, how's that working for you? She says, I don't know, because we just can't get them to shut up and stay sat down. And I said, yeah, well, they have a right to that body. Oh, no, we've already cast them out, but they keep coming back. Needless to say, she has not taken this class, and she was not open for a second opinion. I can tell you right now that every personality is absolutely necessary. How do we know this? It's very simple. If they weren't necessary, they wouldn't exist. They would never have been created. It's that simple. And that is something that you always have to respect and keep in your mind, whether you believe it or not. You have to respect that and keep it in your mind, because what's real to you doesn't matter. If you're going to do this work and be effective, what matters is what's real to them. When you step behind the curtain and you're in their world, now all of a sudden you're an invited guest. And the moment that you go into their world and say, oh, well, you're not real, you're not important, you're not valid, that's when you will lose rapport and you will lose your effectiveness very quickly. So what goes on in their world, even if they come forward and they think they're a beaver, okay, go with it. Go with it. And we'll learn how to help those personalities and everything else, because there's a good reason why they were created that way. So back to our drawing here. Let's suppose that you have somebody created here, back here somewhere. And in that creation, they held the feeling or held the belief that there was no sweetness in life. Now, I'm not saying that this is a standard. I'm just using this as an example. And because they believed that, the body hope I spelled that right. I really don't care. I've heard that the brightest people in the world can spell the same word in 7 different ways. So that's one. They held that belief that there was no sweetness in life, and when this personality comes forward, the body takes on and reflects the energy of the belief system of that personality. Give you an example. I had a client came to my office, and I had an outer office, and then I had an inner office where we did all the private work in there, and the outer office was basically a waiting room with a nice fountain and that sort of thing. And I heard bang, bang, bang on the door, and I was expecting her. And so I opened the door, and she came stumbling in, fell flat on the floor, and stone drunk, just absolutely drunk. And you could smell the alcohol, and I bent down to help her up, and she was out. And so I was almost in a panic. I was going to call 911. What was I going to do? And I paused for just a second, and then all of a sudden, somebody came forward and switched, and she sat up, rubbed her nose, and brushed her hair back, and she says, "I'm sorry, Keith. That was the only way we could get her to come, was to get her drunk, because she just didn't want to know about the rest of us." And I said, "Okay, well, come on in." And so the body got up, and we went on in, and we sat down, and I would say within 10 minutes, the alcohol smell dissipated. The personalities that were there, that presented themselves, that wanted to work during that session, they were all very sober, very alert. Any sign of drunkenness was completely gone, including the smell. And when it was time to go, I just thought it would be a good idea to bring this personality forward, because after all, she's the one that made the appointment. And so I invited her forward, and the moment that she was forward, she was drunk. Speech was slurred, and this was 2 hours later, but speech was slurred and just like what you would expect somebody drunk. And she wasn't making sense, and so we had to invite another personality who could drive to come forward and take the system home. Another case, I had a client who, very fair-skinned, very conservative, and behind the curtain in her landscape, she had one personality that referred to herself as Biker Chick. And Biker Chick was the protector personality, and she came forward, and she was tough. Man, she was tough as nails. And we hit it off, and I explained what I was doing, and she thought about it, and she says, "Okay, I'll help you." And so I needed to find out what the mindscape was like, and so I had her tell me, because my client had never been behind the curtain. Okay, they always had a room for her off the stage, and so she had no idea what her mindscape was like. But Biker Chick knew it really well. In fact, she had a best friend, Harley. Okay, Harley Davidson, and we'll talk about Harley in future videos. But Biker Chick, when she was in my office and in my chair for probably about 35, 40 minutes, and she was present, and you could feel her energy. You could feel she was the part. She was Biker Chick. And Biker Chick had tattoos. My client didn't. My client's body didn't. But as Biker Chick stayed in the body, you could make out the faint lines of tattoos on her arm. And at a certain point, she finally just pointed at them and described some of her tattoos for me. And I said, "That's very interesting." And I could see them. They were faint, but I could see them coming to the surface. Yeah. The body will take on the belief system of the personalities that's forward. Diabetes, I remember early on reading a case where a lady came to see her general practitioner, and she had a chronic disease very similar to diabetes, and a couple weeks later, another personality brought the body in for a different disease or illness. Maybe it was a checkup, I don't remember, but no signs of diabetes. No signs of diabetes in the blood work. Okay. And they kept, every other week, they kept coming back. And finally, the receptionist who did the billing caught on that two different patients shared the same billing address. And when the next one came, she called him on it and said, "Is this your billing address?" "Yes." Do you have a roommate or a sister?" "No." "Well, who's this person?" And she switched on the spot. What we've learned from that is, depending upon the belief system and the energy that the personality carries, the body, in most cases, will register that energy. It will take the form of the belief system behind it. Now, the ramifications of that idea are through the roof. And we don't even have time in these learnings to even touch 1/5 of all of the possibilities that entails. I will tell you a story of another case later in future videos on how important that is and how powerful that is. But today we're talking about the timeline, the mapping. So here's another thing that happens. And this happens usually, it's a takeoff of these way back in the beginning. Now, we are going to cover, and I hope you subscribe to the section on satanic ritual abuse, and it will explain the whole story behind it. It's better than Star Wars. We will explain the whole story behind it and everything behind it. And we're just going to touch on this for just a second. What will happen is, as you have an alter, and usually a very young alter, who is feeling an intense emotion, somebody from outside the system, and just so that we can identify them, we're going to give them a couple of horns. Somebody from outside the system comes up to that personality and says, "Hey, you look a lot like me." And that personality will say, "Yeah? What is it that you're holding? What is it that you're wearing?" "Well, this is sadness." "I have sadness. We should be friends." And they will actually befriend that personality, and in time introduce them to others, and they are able to basically take these personalities into a room. We're just going, for our purposes, we're going to call it a room or a realm. That's probably a better word. They take them into a realm and they create other personalities from that. And that's all we're going to touch on that for that there. But if you look at our host way up here and you look way back here, you can see that she is so distant from all of this. If she had to deal with even the concepts of everybody back here, if she had to deal with all of that, there's no way she could function in everyday life. And she's kind of important, because if she wasn't functioning, then the ride would be over for all of these. Now, question that is often asked when we get to this point: okay, what happens when a person dies? What happens to all of these? Where does everybody go? Truthful answer to that, I don't know completely. I don't know. However, I do know that as a person approaches death, energy that is not theirs, that they're holding on to, that was given to them because of abuse, is released. And as it's released, the assumption is that they join back together like they were in the beginning. Okay? I don't know. I have never talked with anybody over here after death to find that out. I have talked with others who have said, yeah, Keith, you're pretty close on that. You're pretty close on that. I've met people who have had near-death experiences. In fact, I would say a little over half of the people that I've worked with had near-death experiences, but that near-death experience happened way back here before the age of 5. And yeah, so anyhow, coming back to the body registering the energy or the belief system of the altar, there is, and you will find them in a well-developed system, there is a guy, a personality that is simply called the body regulator. And in men, it's most of the time it's a female personality. And in women, I have never had a situation where it was not a male personality. And when you find that personality, they will usually come forward, and the energy that they carry, the character that they are, is usually some guy who is way overtired, doesn't care much. He's just doing his job. He's in overalls. He's probably got a pocket protector and a few tools hanging off of him. And when he comes forward, they're usually a little annoyed, and they'll say, "What?" And sometimes it's good to talk to the body regulator and say, "Hey, listen, we're going to be working with everybody, and there's going to be a lot of switching happening. And we don't want to alarm you because it's going to come back to basically what you're accustomed to now, at least for today." And they appreciate hearing that. And I've asked them, I said, "Well, so what's it like where you're at?" And they tell me usually it's basically a control room with switches and buttons and meters and gauges and that sort of thing. And their job is to regulate the body chemistry according to the personality that is coming forward at that time. And that body chemistry can change drastically. And that's why those guys are usually annoyed. And the reason why it's a guy, and I don't know any delicate way of explaining this, the reason why it's a guy is because these guys, they don't care what time of month it is. When a menstrual cycle is due on their calendar, that's when they pull that switch or they push that button and they say, "Okay, according to my schedule, the calendar says we start on this day and we end on this day." Boom, boom. And I was told, and I was told this by a female personality who was not a body regulator, but she knew the body regulator very well. She looked at me kind of in disbelief and said, if the body regulator was a female, women would never have periods. So take it for what it is. That's just how it was explained to me. So that further illustrates the whole concept as to the body taking on the energy of the belief system of the altar that happens to be forward at that time. This happens all the time. Remember I said that this host is completely unaware of what's going on back here? Well, let's just say that we have an altar personality right here that stems from abuse way back here. And this personality holds a memory. Now, behind the curtain, the concept of time and space is different than what it is on our side of the curtain. So if this one has a memory, to them, that memory can be just as fresh as if it just happened, rather than it happened 40 years ago. Okay? And let's suppose that this one here wants to come down and talk to this one here. And they're just going to come like that. At some point, this one is going to cross paths with this one. And it may be just fleeting, but the way that looks from our side of the curtain is this. This one could be cutting up chicken for dinner and all of a sudden having a flashback of a memory, just a flash of a memory of an incident that happened in her life, and she can't quite put her finger on it. Now, is she just not remembering? Well, that's partly true because it's not her job to remember what happened back here. But what is happening is as this one crosses paths, the memory is fresh with this one, and this one gets just a glimpse of that energy. They can just feel, it's just like brushing by that energy. And that information is transferred to the host, and the host then goes, oh, wow, what was that all about? And usually the flashback is tied to something that is triggering. In our example here, cutting up chicken for dinner. Okay? And then those kind of situations, when personalities are traveling all over within the system, those kind of situations is what brings the clients into your office in the first place. Well, let's get real. The clients that come and see me have been through at least 3.5. We ran the numbers once. At least 3.5 psychologists or counselors, and by the time they got to me, they were pretty much a lost cause, and we were able to help them. But the thing that gets them to that counselor in the first place is the fact that they can't quite put a finger on that flashback, and they want to know what it is. Okay, now where else have we seen this? We see this without the alters and without diabetes and that sort of thing. We see this in other therapy models that I had no idea until I actually for a while had a radio show. It was called Choices with Keith Redford. It was a lot of fun, and I interviewed practitioners from all modalities, and it was really fun. One guy that I met, he was both a shaman and a kahuna. I forget whether it was his mother's line or his father's line, but we were talking one day, and I explained all of this, and he says, "Oh, well, what you have described is called a shamanic journey." And I said, "A shamanic journey? Well, what does that look like?" And he says, "Well, usually what happens is you have your client get nice and relaxed, and they turn around in their mind and they start walking down their life path, and somewhere they're going to meet a younger version of themselves." I said, "Really?" And he said, and then we do something that other modalities call soul retrieval, which means that when they meet, that the older version will communicate with that, and in most cases give them some kind of understanding. There's an exchange there, and they will take and hug them and bring them in. And then he said, it's a very emotional thing when this happens. And as he's saying that, I'm going, oh, of course it's an emotional thing. This one's still carrying emotion. Emotion from abuse from way back here. And they just hug them in, and they bring them home, back into their heart. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, yeah, what you've done is you have done what's called an integration, where you've hugged that personality back through the heart chakra, because the holders, they tend to go towards the heart, and the doers tend to go towards the mind. And we'll talk about that in upcoming videos. But what you've done is you've integrated an alter personality, and you've done it without releasing the emotion, the negative emotion that they hold. Now you can do this, and in fact they do this in clinical therapy all the time. The problem is, what do you do when you've got hundreds of personalities that hold all of that emotion that has been held in reserve so the body doesn't have to process it? Now what you're doing, Now what you're doing is you're bringing that energy into the body so that the body is now going to process it. To me, when I heard this, and incidentally, there's a word for that. It's called an abreaction. That's where a client will relive the trauma. When I heard about abreactions, and I experienced my first one, I saw it, I thought, how horrific that a person has to relive the horror and relive the drama of the abuse that created the problem in the first place, and they've got to relive that to heal? That just doesn't make sense. And I said, well, that's how it's done in the clinical world. And I said, there's got to be a better way. And little did I know that comment there was going to send me on this journey to begin with. So this technique of, well, let's see, there's four. I was able to come up with four different labels for it. They call them shamanic journeys. They call them soul retrieval. They call this age regression therapy, and another one is inner child work. And really, without realizing it, they have become blind men of Hindustan looking at the elephant, and they're looking at it with a different perception. And actually all they're doing is they're helping the host come back and communicate with different alter personalities. Simply put, that's all that happens on those types of therapy models. So he had the best time calling himself a shamanic kahuna. In fact, we practiced that shamanic kahuna. It sounds really cool. Anyway, we had the best of time discussing all of this, and we essentially parted ways with understanding that we're both talking about the same thing. We're just using different languages. So what do you do when you've got all of these alters that are just sitting around doing nothing? Well, they're not doing nothing. They're in reserve, the ones that are doers. In fact, I ought to write doers down here. Boy, that looks terrible. It doesn't matter. The doers are in reserve for when they're needed. The holders they're doing their job. They're holding that emotion. Usually when you find them, it looks like a room full of babies or children below 5. And we'll talk about that in future videos, but you'll find them in rooms where caretakers are in taking care of them. Okay? And we've got some techniques that will help them release all the emotion. Whereas they go, what happens when you've got somebody who it appears, well, let's do it this way. I'm just going to go like that, and we'll take this one here. We'll just create one. Why not? The system can create it, so can we. What happens when you have one that leaves the system? Leaves the system. Now we're talking geographical, okay? Where does the system end? Energy workers will tell you that it basically ends at the end or the outer reaches of your auric field. That is true. According to some philosophies and belief systems in the energy work, when you get to the outer edge of your auric field, there are actually energetic plates, if you will, that are hexagonal in shape, and they act as a protection to protect you from other energies coming in. Well, in the case of our clients, those auric fields are blown apart. Those plates there's big gaping holes in those auric fields. And in those holes, entities or energies can come into those holes and they can go out of those holes. So what do you do when you have a personality that goes out of the system, basically leaves the auric field? Where do they go? Well, in a world where time and space has a whole different concept, they can go anywhere and at any time. They can go anywhere and at any time. My first experience with this was with a client. We're going to call her Kathy again. And before we started a session, she said, "There's somebody who wants to talk to you." I said, "Okay." That was not uncommon for me. "Okay." And they came forward and they said, "Your son did not do what he got in trouble for." And I said, "Okay. You need to apologize to him." "Okay, I can do that. I can take care of that when I get home." And they pretty good detail about the situation. And then I thought, how do you know? So I asked, how do you know this? And she simply told me, "Well, we have parts that keep an eye on you. And we were there when you scolded him." I thought, oh, wow. That's an interesting concept. And I have found that when I used to travel as a therapist, and I would travel from client to client, a lot of them, when they would pick me up at the airport, they would look at me, and some of them would actually come up and touch my face, and they would say, "You're just exactly like they described." And I would say, "Who?" "Well, we have parts of us that have been to your house to see if you were for real and if you could really come and help us." You know, little Twilight Zone music right there would be appropriate, but this happened often. And so it raises a question as a therapist: how do you protect yourself? Well, it's very easy. You do your best to bring as much light energy inside your system as possible. And for me, it's good music. For me, it's reading uplifting, enlightening things, such as scriptures. There's lots of ways of doing it. And whenever I come up with an emotional issue of my own, I make sure that I process it and clear it and learn the lesson that I can from it as best I can, and I move on. And I do my best to have as much positive energy in my life as possible, especially when I'm working with someone, because I know that I'm not alone. I'm not alone. There's a potential problem here. What happens when you integrate everybody together and you've got personalities outside the system? Well, there's a principle involved in that, and that comes in an upcoming video. Too much to share on this one. Like I said at the beginning, I can't think of a single time when I have taken this diagram and presented it to a client. This will not help you really, because, well, I guess it could, if you're wanting to explain to this one here what has happened in their life. But the reason why this is so limited is because, yes, I'm drawing this on on a two-dimensional plane, but in actuality, this is on a multi-dimensional plane. And it's within the body, within the mind, and within the auric field. And as we just explained, sometimes it spills out beyond that field and outside the system. So to explain this in greater detail, it's very difficult to do. Just understand that here it is a two-dimensional thing. Now, another reason why I almost never share this with a client, or I never have shared this with a client, is because when we come behind the curtain and we start working with some of these over here, our work goes so fast, that if we were to come back in here and say, okay, this is 20-year-old Kathy, and then we come back here, and this is 19-year-old Kathy and 18-year-old Kathy, and that 18-year-old Kathy had this happen, and we got this, and we got this, and we got this. By the time we were to do this, at the end of the session, this whole map is now completely different. Traditional therapy, not so much, because they will spend years trying to find who's who and what they do. Okay? That was just way too slow for me. I wanted my wife to be healed a lot sooner than that. And the biggest help with this is to give you a fundamental understanding as to what happens in the lifeline of a person and what happens behind the curtain. Because keep in mind, this person here who is coming into your office, they're not even aware of what goes on behind here. And in our next video, we're going to discuss how I approach a session that is going to be convincing and very enlightening, both for you and for your client, and will get you on the road to really bringing about positive change. Word change. I had a dear friend in a therapy model that when she came to one of my seminars, she said, "Keith, I just don't feel right about reintegrating people. I just don't feel that changes their journey." And I thought for a second, and I said, "Isn't that what they're paying you for? Is to come in and change their journey? Because their journey isn't serving them anymore. You're supposed to be, that's what you're doing." So in my approach to things, sometimes I'm a little assertive, and that's okay. Because if you don't take action, nothing will happen. And that's why conventional therapy models take forever to do. The only thing that I would temper that with is you have to make sure that your intentions are pure, that you're doing this with a spirit of unconditional love and with a spirit of wanting to serve the highest and best good of your client. So, thank you. That concludes this concept, and we will hopefully you'll binge watch the next video. Thank you.